Hey guys, it's Penelope in London. I'm continuing reading from Aion, and it's by Carl Jung, and the book is on the screen. I've started this, we've got from 68, paragraph 68, and I read in the first video I made to paragraph 73. So what I'm going to do is come off screen, and I'm going to basically read maybe about 5 or 6 chapters, not 6 chapters, 5 or 6 paragraphs, and then I'll continue with the chapter 5 because I think it's fascinating. So let me just change screen. And what I'm going to do is go to this beautiful, beautiful swan. And I'm going to come off camera and I'm going to read. Okay, catch you later. Right, so what we've got is here. And I'm going to start reading paragraph 74. So there can be no doubt that the original Christian conception of the imago Dei embodied in Christ meant in all embracing totality that even includes the animal side of man. Nevertheless, the Christ symbol lacks wholeness in the modern psychological sense, since it does not include the dark side of things, but specifically excludes it in the form of Luciferian opponent or a Luciferian opponent. Although the exclusion of the power of evil was something that Christian consciousness was well aware of, all it lost in the effect was an insubstantial shadow, for through the doctrine of the privado boni, first propounded by Origen, evil was characterized as a mere diminution of good and thus deprived of substance. According to the teachings of the church, evil is simply the accidental lack of perfection. This assumption resulted in the proposition omne bonum adeo, and these words, I think they're Latin actually, but I'm going to try and read them and we'll make sense of it. I'm going to go back over this when I've got through this book. I'm going to go over the bits and use Latin to understand what this means, because I don't know Latin, so I'll keep reading. So if I don't pronounce it correctly, do forgive me. So he says, omne bonum adeo, omne malum ab humain, I think that says. Another logical consequence was the subsequent elimination of the devil in each Protestant sects. And this is now 79 or 75, sorry. Thanks to the doctrine of the privado boni, wholeness seemed guaranteed in the figure of Christ. One must, however, take evil rather more substantially when one meets it on the plane of empirical psychology. It is simply the opposite of good. In the ancient world of Gnostics, whose arguments were very much influenced by the psychic experience, tackled the problem of evil on a broader basis than the church fathers. For instance, one of the things they taught was that Christ cast off his shadow from himself. If we give this view the weight that's quite interesting. If we give this view the weight it deserves, we can easily recognize the cut-off counterpart in the figure of Antichrist. The Antichrist develops in legend as a perverse imitator of Christ's life. He is a true, and again, this is Greek, I think here, I can't read that bit, but an imitating spirit of evil who follows in Christ's footsteps like a shadow following the body. This complementing of the bright but one-sided figure of the Redeemer, we even find traces of it in the New Testament, must be of especial significance, and indeed considerable attention was paid to it quite early. If we see the traditional figure of Christ as a parallel to the psychic manifestation of the self, when the Antichrist would correspond to the shadow of self, namely the dark half of the human totality, which ought not to be judged too optimistically. So far as we can judge from experience, light and shadow are so evenly distributed in a man's nature that his psychic totality appears, to say the least of it, in a somewhat murky light. The psychological concept of the self, in part, derived from the knowledge of the whole man, but for the rest, depicting itself spontaneously in the products of the unconscious of an archetypal quantity bound together by inner anemones, cannot omit the shadow that belongs to the light figure, for without it, this figure lacks body and humanity. In the empirical self, light and shadow form a paradoxical unity in the Christian concept. On the other hand, the archetype is hopefully split into irreconcilable halves, leading ultimately to a metaphysical dualism, the final separation of the kingdom of heaven from the fiery world of the damned. Now this is 77. I just read 76 there, just to be clear. Paragraph 77. For anyone who has a positive attitude towards Christianity, the problem of the Antichrist is a hard nut to crack. It is nothing less than the counterstroke of the devil provoked by God's incarnation, for the devil attains his true stature as the adversary of Christ and hence of God only after the rise of Christianity. While at late as the book of Job, he will still one of God's sons and on familiar terms with Yahoo. Psychologically, the case is clear, since the dogmatic figure of Christ is so sublime and spotless that everything else turns black beside it. It is, in fact, so one-sidedly perfect that it demands a psychic complement to restore the balance. This inevitable opposition led very early to the doctrine of the two sons of God, of whom the elder was called Sataniel. The coming of the Antichrist is not just a proheric prediction, it is inexorable psychological law whose existence through the unknown to the author of Jonathan Epictetus, I think it says, brought him a sure knowledge of the impending enantiodromia. I'm going to say that again, enantiodromia. Consequently, he wrote as if he were conscious of the inner reality and necessity for the transformation. Though we may be sure that the idea seemed to him like a divine revelation, in reality, every intensified differentiation of the Christ image brings about a corresponding attenuation of its unconscious complement, thereby increasing the tension between above and below. This is now 78. In making these statements, we are keeping entirely within the sphere of Christian psychology and symbolism, a factor that no one has reckoned with. However, in the fatality inherent in the Christian disposition itself, which leads inevitably to a reversal of its spirit, not through the obscure workings of chance, but in accordance with the psychological law, the ideal of spirituality arriving for the heights was doomed to clash with the materialistic earthbound passion to conquer matter and master the world. This change became visible at the time of the Renaissance. The word means rebirth, and it referred to the renewal of the antique spirit. We know today that this spirit was chiefly a mask. It was not the spirit of antiquity that was reborn, but the spirit of medieval Christianity that underwent strange pagan transformations, exchanging the heavenly goal for the earthly one, and for the vertical of the Gnostic style for a horizontal perspective, voyages of discovery, exploration of the world and of nature. The subsequent development that led to the Enlightenment and the French Revolution have produced a worldwide situation today which can only be called anti-Christian. In a sense, that confirms the early Christian anticipation of the end of time. It is as if, with the coming of Christ, opposites that were latent till then had become manifest, or as if a pendulum had swung violently on one side and were now carrying out the complementary movement in the opposite direction. He goes on to say, no tree, this is beautiful actually, because I've seen this meme so many times, no tree, is it said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. The double meaning of this movement lies in the nature of the pendulum. Christ is without spot, but right at the beginning of his career, there occurs the encounter with Satan. This is very fascinating when we look at this stuff. And also, I'm going to continue reading the end of this paragraph, But it's very interesting how symbolism, and if we look at mythology, Jung isn't saying this, I'm saying what my thoughts are. As an evolutionary astrologer, in part, when I look at the stars and I look at the constellations, when we begin to look and we go back in time, we can see how the constellations were brought into the Bible and into, you know, the mythology, and just how powerful symbols are. And when we look at light and dark, if we look at also the first page of Genesis, I've got the Bible that I use to work with. I'm not religious as such, but I do like to read material, and I do feel like I know God, you know, even though I'm not a particular follower of anything. It's very interesting that we take concepts, and when Jung wrote, you know, the archetypes and the collective unconscious and really what that means, and when we begin the work of Jung, it's very difficult to understand it, but the more we keep going with it, we begin to integrate it. It's just not possible not to. So, you know, definitely looking at the stars, you know, and looking at the constellations. You can get an app, actually. I got an app for my phone, and you can hold it up to the sky and you can see the constellations, and then you can see how it's been used in art and all sorts of things over the years, and the stories as well. But continuing reading this paragraph 78, and then I'll leave it there. So he goes on, let's just get that bit back there. So he said, this bit, Christ is without spot, but right at the beginning of his career, there occurs the encounter with Satan, the adversary, who represents the counterpole of that tremendous tension in the world psyche, which Christ's advent signified. He is in the mysterium in Icutius, I think that says, that accompanies the soul, Eustia, it looks like, as inseparably as the shadow belongs to the light, in exactly the same way to the Ebuntes and Acutes. It's very, some of these words are tough for me, but you know, I still think that I'm picking up what he's saying, and I hope anybody listening is also. So then he goes on, thought that one brother cleaves to the other. Both strive for a kingdom, one for the kingdom of heaven, the other for the principalus huius mundi. We hear of a reign of 1,000 years and of the comparing of the Antichrist, of the coming, and of the coming of the Antichrist, just as if a partition of worlds and epikos have taken place between two royal brothers, the meeting with the Satan, and therefore more than mere chance. It was a link in the chain. So we can see how that link in the chain still exists today, you know, between good and evil, and our perception and our judgments and all of the symbolism that goes with it. And where we're at now as well on our evolutionary path, it's becoming very clear to me, you know, we're in a huge time of change and the consciousness of man. I remember a video I saw of Jung on YouTube where he said that, you know, the world is hanging by a thin thread. The world is hanging by a thin thread, and that is the psyche of man. And you couldn't get more real than that, really. And that's the absolute truth. So we must look at the shadow. The shadow is not just to do with our, you know, our dark side. It's to do where we've been repressed and suppressed as well. Things that we've not, you know, taken on or accomplished, or we've shied away from because we've been told something about ourselves that wasn't true. So the shadow in its totality, as we look at it and we begin to integrate, you know, and become whole, then we begin to live fully. And we also are more accepting, not so much accepting of what goes on around us, you know, it doesn't mean we just accept things, but we get to see the bigger picture, and we become less judgmental with that, I would think. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there, and I hope I read smoothly, but maybe not too smoothly because of the words. But anyway, I'm learning as we all are. Right, I'll catch you later. Thanks for watching.